At my granddaughter's wedding, I learned exactly what my family thought I was worth. The ballroom at the Grand Regency in downtown Chicago shimmered under crystal chandeliers, each table dressed in ivory linen and fresh white roses flown in from California, and for a brief moment as I stood near the entrance adjusting the pearl clasp on my navy dress, I allowed myself to feel proud because I had paid for nearly every sparkling detail in that room, from the $38,000 venue deposit to the string quartet rehearsing near the dance floor, and I believed I was helping create a perfect beginning for my granddaughter Emily's new life. But that feeling shifted the second I reached the welcome table and picked up the cream-colored name tag scripted in gold ink, because beneath my name, or what should have been my name, were the words, "The old lady who's paying for everything," and I remember staring at it long enough for the smiling hostess to ask if something was wrong, and instead of answering I simply inhaled, pinned it carefully to my dress, and walked into the reception as though nothing had happened, because dignity has always been my armor and I was not about to remove it in a room full of 200 guests. The music swelled, champagne glasses clinked, and clusters of relatives greeted one another with warm laughter, yet as I moved through the crowd I noticed a few sideways glances drifting toward my chest and then away again too quickly, like children pretending they hadn't been caught whispering, and I saw my daughter-in-law Vanessa across the room in a pale blush gown, her hand resting lightly on my son Daniel's arm as she leaned toward him and said something that made his lips tighten into a brief, uncomfortable smile. And when she spotted me approaching she opened her arms in a graceful, almost theatrical embrace, pressing her cheek to mine and saying, "Margaret, you look wonderful," her voice sweet as iced tea in July, and I thanked her, because what else does a grandmother do at her granddaughter's wedding except keep the peace, and yet beneath the polite exchange I felt the weight of that name tag like a small stone against my heart. Emily, radiant in satin and lace, hurried over moments later, her veil floating behind her, and she kissed my cheek and said, "Thank you for everything, Grandma, this wouldn't have happened without you," and I held her hands and told her she deserved a beautiful day, because she did, she truly did, but I couldn't help noticing that gratitude was whispered privately while the joke about my age and my money was displayed publicly, and that distinction settled into me like a quiet realization I had avoided for years. 6 months earlier, Vanessa had come to my kitchen table with spreadsheets and glossy brochures, explaining how certain upgrades would elevate the guest experience, and I had written checks totaling just over $72,000 without hesitation, covering the caterer's additional per-plate charge, the upgraded floral arch, and even the honeymoon suite at a resort in Maui, because I believed generosity within a family was an investment in love, and I had never once asked for recognition, but I also had never expected to be reduced to a punchline. As the photographer began organizing family portraits, he called for immediate family to the center, and I watched as Vanessa gently guided Daniel and Emily into position beneath the arch of roses while I was steered toward the outer edge of the frame, close enough to be visible but far enough to be secondary, and I stood there smiling, hands folded, remembering when Daniel was a little boy who would grip my skirt before his first day of school, whispering that he was afraid, and I would kneel to his level and promise that I would always be right there, and now here I was, present yet somehow peripheral, witnessing a subtle shift that had been building for years, small comments about how times have changed, or how I didn't need to worry about details, each one harmless on its own but together forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. I excused myself to retrieve a glass of water and pass 2 distant relatives who fell abruptly silent as I approached, and though they offered tight smiles, I caught one of them glancing down at my name tag and suppressing a laugh, and in that moment it became unmistakably clear that this had not been a printing error, not a harmless oversight, but an intentional message disguised as humor, and the calm I felt surprised even me because instead of embarrassment or anger, what rose within me was clarity, the kind that arrives quietly and rearranges everything you thought you understood, and as I stood near the window overlooking Michigan Avenue, watching traffic glide beneath the city lights, I realized that tonight was not only about a wedding but about the truth of my place within this family, and the truth was sharper than I had allowed myself to admit. I turned back toward the dance floor where Vanessa was laughing with a group of guests, one hand lifting her champagne flute in an elegant gesture, and I studied her expression, searching for any flicker of guilt or hesitation, but found only confidence, the kind that comes from believing there will be no consequences, and that was when I understood something essential. They thought I would never push back, never question, never protect myself, because I had always chosen harmony over confrontation, and perhaps that had been my mistake. And as the first dance began and applause filled the room, I touched the edge of the name tag once more, feeling its smooth surface beneath my fingertips, and I made a silent promise to myself that before this celebration ended, would decide whether I was truly just the old lady who paid for everything, or the woman who still held far more power than anyone in that room realized. The applause for the first dance faded into polite conversation, and I remained near the edge of the ballroom watching the way Vanessa moved through the crowd as if she had choreographed not only the reception but every opinion in the room, and I began to replay the last few years in my mind with a clarity that felt almost clinical, because when humiliation is dressed as humor, it rarely begins with something so obvious. It starts with small suggestions, with gentle redirections, with phrases that sound reasonable until you notice they always place you one step further from the center. I remembered the afternoon Vanessa came to my house last spring with a leather folder tucked beneath her arm, explaining that Emily deserved a wedding that reflected modern standards, and how she had leaned forward at my dining table and said that since I had been fortunate with Daniel's late father's retirement investments, perhaps this was my chance to create a legacy moment. And I had agreed because I believed in supporting family milestones, but now I understood how carefully that narrative had been shaped, how my generosity had been reframed into expectation. I moved toward the refreshment table and poured myself a glass of water, steadying my hands not because I felt fragile but because I was gathering information, and I noticed Daniel standing alone near the bar staring into his drink, and for a moment I considered walking over to him, asking him directly whether he had seen the name tag, whether he had approved of it, but I stopped myself because confrontation without preparation rarely leads to truth, and I needed truth more than I needed a scene. A group of guests drifted past me discussing the floral arrangements and the open bar, and one woman said quietly that it must be wonderful to have a grandmother so willing to finance such an event, and the other responded with a soft laugh and said that at least someone was footing the bill, and I realized that the message printed on that card had already traveled farther than I had expected, and that was when the weight of it shifted from personal insult to calculated positioning. Vanessa was not only making a joke, she was establishing a narrative that I was a resource rather than a matriarch, a funding source rather than a foundation. I watched Emily step onto the dance floor again for photographs with her bridesmaids, her happiness genuine and uncomplicated, and I felt a pang of something softer than anger because my granddaughter was not the architect of this, she was simply the beneficiary of it, and I reminded myself that clarity does not require cruelty, that discernment can coexist with love. As the evening continued, I excused myself and stepped into the quieter corridor outside the ballroom where the carpet muted the noise of celebration, and I took a moment to study the name tag once more beneath the softer lighting, tracing the gold lettering with my thumb as if it were a contract I had unknowingly signed, and I considered how many times in the past 2 years I had been gently excluded from decisions about Daniel's business expansion or Emily's graduate school applications. Always told that I should rest, that I had done enough, that they would handle things now. And perhaps this was the natural evolution of age, but perhaps it was something more intentional. When I returned inside, Vanessa was giving instructions to the wedding planner about the timing of the cake cutting, and her confidence radiated outward in smooth, efficient gestures, and I wondered how long she had believed that I would accept being repositioned without question. Daniel finally approached me with a cautious smile and asked whether I was enjoying myself, and I told him that the event was beautifully organized, which was true. And he nodded with relief before glancing at his phone as though something more pressing demanded his attention, and I realized then that avoidance can be as telling as confrontation. I did not mention the name tag, and neither did he, and in that silence a quiet understanding formed that he had seen it, or at the very least had not been surprised by it. The band began playing a lively jazz number, and guests filled the dance floor, and I stood near the head table watching the way Vanessa accepted compliments with practiced grace, thanking everyone for coming, acknowledging vendors by name, yet never once publicly acknowledging the person who had financed the orchestra, the catering, the imported flowers, and the honeymoon suite waiting in Hawaii, and I felt the final piece of the pattern settle into place. This was not about a single printed card, it was about a shift in status, a repositioning that had been building gradually, and as I observed the scene unfolding before me, I understood that my next steps would need to be deliberate, informed, and calm. Because when respect is quietly replaced with utility, the only effective response is to redefine the terms entirely. By the time the cake was wheeled into the center of the ballroom on its polished silver cart, I had already decided that observation would serve me better than reaction, and I watched as Vanessa adjusted the tiers with careful precision, ensuring that every sugar flower faced the audience, ensuring that every camera angle captured her vision rather than the quiet truth behind it, and I stood a few feet away, close enough to hear but far enough to remain unaddressed, feeling the steady calm that comes when confusion gives way to understanding. The master of ceremonies tapped his microphone and invited everyone to gather for the cutting of the cake, and as guests formed a semicircle around the table, Vanessa took the microphone briefly to thank the vendors, the planner, and even the venue manager by name, and then she paused as if considering whether to add something more, but instead she smiled and said that this wedding had been a labor of love for their immediate family, and the words immediate family seemed to hang in the air longer than necessary, drawing a subtle boundary that did not include me. Daniel stood beside her nodding, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, and I wondered whether he heard what I heard in that phrase or whether comfort has a way of softening inconvenient truths. When the applause faded and the first slice of cake was lifted onto a porcelain plate, Emily turned toward me with genuine affection and said that she hoped I was having a wonderful evening, and I assured her that I was proud of her and that the ceremony had been beautiful, which was also true, because love for a grandchild does not dissolve simply because adults choose to misplace respect. Yet beneath the exchange I sensed the widening gap between private gratitude and public acknowledgement, and that distinction mattered more than anyone seemed to realize. I excused myself once more and stepped into a quieter alcove near the coat check, retrieving my phone from my evening bag not to send a message in haste but to revisit a memory that had lingered in the back of my mind since early spring, the afternoon when Vanessa had presented a document she described as a preliminary transfer summary, suggesting that consolidating certain accounts in anticipation of the wedding expenses would streamline tax reporting, and I had declined to sign without independent review, explaining that I preferred clarity over convenience, and she had accepted my answer with a thin smile that never quite reached her eyes. At the time, I had dismissed the moment as ordinary financial caution, yet tonight the recollection felt newly significant, as though that unsigned document had been part of a larger expectation that I would quietly surrender more than funds. I scrolled through my calendar and confirmed that I still had a meeting scheduled next week with our longtime accountant, Mr. Harrison, a man who had managed our family's trust since Daniel was in high school, and I felt reassured by the simple fact that structure remained in place even when sentiment wavered. Returning to the ballroom, I observed Vanessa laughing with a group of distant cousins who appeared amused by something she had whispered, and though I could not hear the content, I noticed one of them glance at my name tag before quickly averting her eyes, and in that small gesture the pattern solidified further. This was theater, not oversight. This was messaging disguised as wit. I walked toward the head table and gently removed the name tag from my dress, smoothing the fabric beneath it before placing the card face down on the polished surface beside my assigned seat, and the act felt less like surrender and more like quiet documentation, as though I were preserving evidence for a moment when clarity would require proof. Daniel approached again and asked whether everything was all right, his tone measured, almost cautious, and I met his gaze steadily and told him that the evening had revealed more than I expected, and he frowned slightly but did not press for explanation, which told me that he sensed the shift yet preferred not to examine it too closely. The band transitioned into a slower melody, and couples began drifting onto the dance floor, and I remained standing, observing the choreography of relationships unfolding before me, understanding now that generosity without boundaries becomes vulnerability, and vulnerability in the presence of ambition becomes leverage. As I looked around the ballroom one more time, I recognized that tonight was not the culmination of something but the unveiling of it, and the calm that settled over me was not resignation but resolve, because when a family chooses to redefine you as a financial instrument rather than a foundational presence, the only response that preserves dignity is to redefine your participation entirely. The music softened into something almost nostalgic as the evening moved toward its final hour, and I remained at the edge of the celebration long enough to observe the rhythms beneath the surface, because once clarity arrives it becomes impossible to unsee the small arrangements that shape a larger story, and I began to trace the timeline backward in my mind with deliberate precision, not out of bitterness but out of responsibility to myself. 2 years ago, when Daniel first mentioned that Emily was serious about her relationship and that an engagement might be near, Vanessa had spoken enthusiastically about creating an unforgettable event, describing venues along the Chicago River and curated menus with imported ingredients, and I remember smiling at her ambition, admiring her organizational confidence, believing that it was a sign of devotion to her daughter, yet I also remember the subtle shift that followed when conversations about funding began to include phrases such as shared contribution and generational support, language that sounded collaborative but gradually narrowed toward a single source. I had offered to assist because I believed in easing burdens, and because after my husband passed away I promised myself that my resources would serve the people I loved rather than accumulate dust in investment statements. but assistance slowly became assumption, and assumption quietly transformed into entitlement. I recall a Sunday afternoon when Vanessa brought a revised budget to my home, the total projected cost approaching $100,000, and she explained that certain elements were non-negotiable if the wedding was to meet expectations. And when I suggested scaling back on a few decorative enhancements, she responded gently that Emily had dreamed of something elegant her entire life. And in that moment I chose generosity over caution, telling myself that joy was worth the price. Yet even then there were small signals I dismissed, such as the way decisions were finalized before I was consulted, or how vendor contracts were forwarded to me with highlighted signature lines rather than invitations for discussion, and I see now that my compliance may have been interpreted not as kindness but as predictability. Back in the ballroom, as guests gathered their coats and the staff began discreetly clearing empty glasses, I watched Vanessa thank the planner one last time, her voice animated and assured, and I realized that for months she had operated under the assumption that my role was defined solely by my checkbook, not by my experience, not by my history, not by the decades I had invested in building the very stability that allowed this evening to exist. Daniel approached me again, his expression softer now that the formalities were nearly complete, and he asked whether I needed assistance getting home, and I told him that I was perfectly capable of arranging my own transportation, which was true, and perhaps my tone carried more weight than he anticipated because he hesitated before nodding, as though sensing that something essential had shifted beyond his immediate comprehension. I glanced toward the head table where my name tag still rested face down, unnoticed among the floral centerpieces, and I considered how easily narratives are constructed when no one challenges them, how a single printed phrase can reframe a lifetime of contribution into a caricature, and I understood that tonight had not diminished me but clarified the boundaries I had neglected to enforce. I thought of my upcoming meeting with Mr. Harrison and of the trust documents he had carefully structured years ago to protect not only assets but intention, and I felt a steady confidence in the knowledge that structure still existed beneath the surface of this celebration, waiting to be activated if necessary. As the last dance concluded and applause echoed one final time, I retrieved my evening bag and walked toward the exit without announcing my departure, passing beneath the chandelier light that reflected faintly against the marble floor, and I realized that while the reception might be ending for everyone else, something far more significant had just begun for me, because recognition of one's true position within a family is not an ending but a beginning, and as I stepped out into the cool Chicago night air, I carried with me not humiliation but resolve, aware that generosity is a gift only when it is respected, and that respect, once withheld, invites a recalibration that few people anticipate until it is already underway. The ride home from the Grand Regency was quiet, the city lights sliding across the window of the car as though nothing of consequence had occurred, and I sat with my hands folded in my lap replaying the evening not with wounded pride but with measured evaluation, because once I stepped into the cool air outside the hotel, I understood that tonight had provided something more valuable than applause or gratitude. It had provided evidence. When I reached my house in Lincoln Park, the porch light still glowing as it had for decades, I removed my heels carefully and set them beside the entryway table my husband once refinished by hand, and the familiar scent of polished wood and lavender greeted me with a steadiness that felt grounding, and I walked into the kitchen without turning on the television or checking messages, because clarity requires quiet. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the same oak table where Vanessa had once spread out vendor contracts and decorative samples, and I allowed my mind to revisit that afternoon in detail. The way she had spoken about efficiency and consolidation, about transferring certain disbursements into a streamlined wedding account, and how she had presented a document that suggested partial reclassification of funds as irrevocable gifts, language that would have permanently shifted ownership from discretionary support to unconditional transfer, and I had declined politely, saying that I preferred my contributions to remain structured through the existing family trust until after the wedding, and she had smiled, though her expression tightened at the corners, and I see now that her disappointment was not about paperwork but about access. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as I retrieved the leather portfolio from my study cabinet, the one containing the original trust documents that Mr. Harrison drafted 8 years ago after my husband passed away, and I spread them across the table with the same calm I once used when reviewing Daniel's college applications. And there in precise legal language was the clause that allowed discretionary distributions for significant life events at the trustee's judgment, which was mine alone. And there was also the condition that public misrepresentation or misuse of allocated funds could trigger immediate suspension of future distributions, and I realized that structure had anticipated exactly what sentiment had overlooked. I did not feel anger as I read those pages, I felt steadiness, because the difference between generosity and obligation is documentation, and documentation was on my side. I checked the calendar on my phone and confirmed my appointment with Mr. Harrison for Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, and I drafted a brief message requesting that we review all wedding-related disbursements and clarify their classification within the trust framework, ensuring that every dollar was properly recorded as conditional support rather than unrestricted transfer, and I sent it without hesitation. The house remained silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beyond the windows, and in that quiet I allowed myself to consider Daniel not as a son I had raised but as an adult who had chosen alignment, and I recognized that while Vanessa might orchestrate narratives, Daniel had permitted them, and permission carries its own responsibility. I rose from the table and walked into the living room where framed photographs lined the mantel, images of birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, and I studied one of Emily at 12 years old holding a science fair ribbon, her smile bright and unguarded, and I reminded myself that correction does not require cruelty, that boundaries can be drawn without bitterness, and that love for a grandchild can coexist with recalibration toward her parents. Before going upstairs, I returned to my purse and removed the name tag I had placed inside earlier, smoothing its edges between my fingers under the kitchen light, reading the printed phrase once more not as an insult but as confirmation, and I set it carefully inside the portfolio with the trust documents, because sometimes the smallest artifacts become the clearest markers of intent. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I did not feel diminished. I felt aligned, because tonight had transformed an unspoken dynamic into something visible, and visibility invites response, and for the first time since wedding planning began, I understood that my next action would not be reactive but deliberate, structured, and impossible to misunderstand. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of clear Midwestern sunlight that makes everything appear sharper than it felt the night before, and I drove downtown to Mr. Harrison's office on LaSalle Street with the leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat beside me, not as a weapon but as documentation, because clarity does not require drama, it requires structure. The lobby of the building was quiet at 10 o'clock, the marble floors polished to a reflective sheen, and when I stepped into the elevator I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, composed, steady, not the caricature printed on that wedding name tag but a woman who had spent decades building stability through patience and discipline. Mr. Harrison greeted me with the same measured courtesy he had shown since my husband and I first walked into his office 20 years ago, and after brief pleasantries he sensed from my expression that this meeting was not routine. I placed the portfolio on his desk and removed the name tag first, laying it flat between us without commentary, and he adjusted his glasses to read the printed phrase, his brow tightening almost imperceptibly before he looked up and asked whether this had been distributed publicly at the reception, and I confirmed that it had been displayed at my assigned seat among 200 guests. I did not dramatize the moment, I simply described the sequence of events, the public omission during speeches, the language of immediate family, and the previous attempt to reclassify funds as irrevocable gifts, and as I spoke I realized that recounting the facts without emotion made them more powerful, because there was no exaggeration to dispute. Mr. Harrison opened the trust binder and reviewed the discretionary distribution clause, reminding me that all wedding-related payments had been issued through the family trust under conditional allocation for a significant life event, and that ownership of those funds remained subject to trustee oversight until formally released, which had not occurred. He explained that if public misrepresentation of those funds suggested they were unconditional gifts, I retained the authority to suspend future distributions and require formal acknowledgement of their structured nature, and he asked whether I intended to exercise that authority. I paused for a moment, not because I doubted the legality but because I understood the weight of precedent, and I told him that I intended to protect the integrity of the trust rather than retaliate, that any action taken would be documented, proportional, and transparent. He nodded approvingly and recommended that we issue a formal clarification letter outlining the classification of the wedding expenditures as conditional support pending final accounting, and that we schedule a review of projected future distributions for Daniel and Vanessa's household, particularly those earmarked for business expansion or property investment. And as he spoke I felt the steady reassurance of process replacing the vague discomfort of assumption. We drafted language carefully, avoiding accusation while asserting structure, and by the end of the meeting a formal notice was prepared to be sent by certified mail, not to embarrass but to clarify, not to punish but to define. As I left the office, the city noise felt distant, as though I were moving within a calmer current beneath it, and I understood that the most effective response to subtle disrespect is precise documentation. That afternoon, back at my home, I reviewed the trust ledger once more and noted every wedding-related disbursement, from the venue deposit to the honeymoon suite, confirming that each payment aligned with the conditional event category, and I felt neither vindictive nor triumphant, only aligned with the intention my husband and I had set years ago when we created the structure that now stood quietly in my favor. Daniel had not yet called, and I did not initiate contact, because clarity delivered formally carries more weight than emotion delivered privately. And I suspected that when the certified envelope arrived at their home, conversation would follow naturally. I placed the trust binder back into the cabinet and kept the name tag inside the portfolio rather than discarding it, not as a reminder of insult but as evidence of context, and as evening settled over the house I realized that the balance of power had never truly shifted away from me. It had merely gone unacknowledged, and acknowledgement, once formalized, changes everything without a single raised voice. The certified letter was delivered on Thursday afternoon, and I knew the moment it arrived because Daniel called that evening with a tone I had not heard since he was a teenager caught between confusion and consequence, and his voice carried restraint rather than anger as he asked whether there had been some misunderstanding regarding the trust clarification he and Vanessa had received, and I told him calmly that there had been no misunderstanding at all, only documentation, and that the letter simply reflected the existing structure we had always maintained. He paused before responding, and in that pause I recognized the subtle shift that occurs when assumption meets reality, and he explained that Vanessa felt blindsided by the language referencing conditional allocation and potential suspension of future distributions, and I replied that transparency often feels abrupt when expectations have been built without confirmation, and I asked him whether he had reviewed the original trust documents in recent years, and he admitted that he had not. I did not raise my voice, nor did I mention the wedding directly, because the letter itself carried enough context, and instead I invited him to come by the house the following Saturday morning so we could sit together and read through the documents in full, not as adversaries but as adults who needed clarity, and he agreed, though I sensed reluctance beneath his consent. Saturday arrived with a quiet steadiness, and when Daniel stepped into the house he looked around as though seeing it differently, perhaps recognizing that every beam and brick represented years of intention rather than obligation, and we sat at the oak table where he once completed school assignments while I reviewed his essays, and I placed the trust binder before him along with a printed ledger of all wedding-related disbursements, and I explained methodically how each payment had been issued under the discretionary event clause, remaining conditional until formally released, and that public representation of those funds as unconditional gifts contradicted the documented framework. He listened without interruption, occasionally running his hand through his hair in a gesture I remembered from his college years when he faced difficult exams, and when he finally spoke he said that Vanessa had believed the funds were a gift, that she had assumed my silence signaled agreement, and I told him gently that silence often signals patience, not surrender. I then removed the name tag from the portfolio and placed it on the table between us, not dramatically but deliberately, and I asked him whether he believed it accurately represented my role within the family, and he stared at the printed words longer than he had at the ledger, and his expression shifted from defensiveness to discomfort. And he admitted that he had noticed it at the reception but assumed it was meant in jest, and I told him that humor built on hierarchy rarely feels harmless to the person positioned beneath it. I explained that my decision to issue the clarification letter was not retaliation for a single printed phrase but a response to a broader pattern of assumption regarding access and entitlement, and that the trust existed precisely to prevent confusion between generosity and obligation, and I assured him that I did not intend to harm Emily's future or destabilize their household, but I would no longer allow ambiguity to define my contributions. Daniel leaned back in his chair and asked whether this meant that future financial support would cease entirely, and I answered that future support would proceed according to structure rather than assumption, that transparency would replace implication, and that respect would accompany every distribution, and as I spoke I saw something settle within him, not agreement perhaps, but recognition. When he left later that morning, he carried a copy of the trust summary and the ledger, and he said he would review everything with Vanessa, and I watched him walk down the front steps with a posture more contemplative than confrontational, and I understood that clarity had introduced a new dynamic that could not be undone by casual dismissal. The house felt calm once more, and I returned the binder to its cabinet, aware that this conversation marked not an escalation but a recalibration, and that recalibration, when rooted in structure and delivered without bitterness, alters the balance quietly yet permanently. 3 days passed before Vanessa called, and when her name appeared on my phone screen I let it ring once longer than necessary, not to create tension but to ensure that when I answered my voice would reflect steadiness rather than reaction, and when I greeted her she did not waste time on pleasantries. explaining that the letter from Mr. Harrison had caused considerable stress in their household and that she felt publicly corrected for what she described as a misunderstanding, and I listened without interruption because interruption often escalates what clarity can resolve. She said that the wedding had been intended as a joyful event and that the printed name tag had been a light-hearted joke created by a member of the planning team, and I responded calmly that humor is measured not by intention but by impact, and that the public framing of my role as a financial instrument rather than a family elder required formal clarification, not emotional debate. There was a brief silence on the line before she asked whether I intended to withdraw future support entirely, and I told her that future distributions would proceed strictly according to documented structure, which had always been the case, and that transparency would replace assumption moving forward. She shifted her tone slightly, suggesting that Emily would be disappointed if family unity were compromised over what she described as a small detail, and I replied that unity built on imbalance is temporary, while unity grounded in respect is sustainable, and that my actions were designed to preserve long-term stability rather than to undermine it. After we ended the call, I placed the phone on the kitchen counter and felt neither vindicated nor troubled, only certain that the dynamic had changed irreversibly. Later that afternoon, I received an electronic notification confirming that Mr. Harrison's office had updated the trust ledger to reflect the wedding expenditures as conditional allocations pending formal acknowledgement, and I reviewed the summary carefully, noting each entry with the same attention I once gave to balancing household accounts, because precision reinforces authority. That evening, Daniel sent a brief message stating that he and Vanessa had reviewed the documentation and wished to discuss a path forward that would clarify expectations for any future financial involvement, and I responded that I welcomed clarity and suggested that all such discussions include Mr. Harrison so that structure would guide conversation rather than emotion. The following week, we convened in the same LaSalle Street office where I had met with Mr. Harrison days earlier, and Vanessa appeared composed but noticeably restrained, her posture reflecting awareness rather than assumption, and as Mr. Harrison outlined the discretionary distribution framework once more, emphasizing that trustee authority exists to protect both assets and relationships, I observed the subtle shift in their expressions when they realized that the structure was not newly imposed but long established. Vanessa acknowledged that the wedding planning process may have blurred the line between generosity and entitlement, and she expressed regret that the printed name tag had caused discomfort, and while her words were carefully measured, I accepted them as progress rather than perfection. I explained that my intention was not to diminish their independence but to ensure that my contributions were treated as deliberate support rather than automatic obligation, and I stated clearly that future assistance, whether for business investment, property acquisition, or educational expenses, would require written acknowledgement of conditional allocation, and that public representation of such support would reflect accuracy rather than caricature. The meeting concluded without raised voices, and as we left the building together, Daniel thanked me for maintaining composure throughout the process, and I told him that composure is simply clarity practiced consistently. Driving home beneath the Chicago skyline, I recognized that the most significant change had not occurred within the trust documents but within perception, because once boundaries are articulated and reinforced through structure, they become difficult to dismiss, and for the first time since the wedding, I sensed that my role within the family was no longer assumed but defined, and definition carries a quiet power that does not require display to be understood. In the weeks that followed our meeting at Mr. Harrison's office, something subtle but unmistakable shifted within the rhythm of our family interactions, and I began to notice the difference not in grand gestures but in language, in the careful way requests were framed and acknowledgments were expressed, and I understood that structure had accomplished what emotion never could. Daniel called one evening to ask whether I would consider contributing to a modest investment he and Vanessa were exploring, a small commercial property on the north side that he believed had strong potential, and his tone carried a level of respect that had been absent during the wedding planning months, and before discussing numbers he clarified that he understood any participation would follow the established trust guidelines, with written acknowledgement of conditional allocation, and I told him that I appreciated his clarity and that I would review the proposal formally. A few days later, Vanessa sent an email outlining the investment details with precise documentation attached, and at the bottom of her message she included a sentence thanking me for my continued support and recognizing the role I have played in providing stability for their family, and though the wording was measured, I recognized its significance because acknowledgement, when expressed voluntarily, reflects awareness rather than obligation. Emily visited the following Sunday afternoon, still glowing from newlywed excitement, and she brought a framed photograph from the wedding reception, one taken during the father-daughter dance where I stood in the background smiling softly, and she handed it to me with a quiet apology for how certain elements of the reception had unfolded, explaining that she had not fully understood the implications of the printed name tag until afterward, and I told her gently that growth often arrives after reflection, and that what matters most is how we respond once clarity appears. We sat together at the kitchen table sharing tea, and she asked thoughtful questions about the trust structure, curious about how long it had been in place and why her grandfather and I had chosen such detailed provisions, and I explained that foresight is a form of care, that structure prevents misunderstanding, and that respect is preserved when expectations are defined rather than implied. As she listened, I sensed that this generation might yet learn from what the previous one had nearly overlooked, and I felt a quiet reassurance that correction does not fracture relationships when it is delivered with steadiness. Later that week, Mr. Harrison finalized the reclassification of the wedding expenditures as conditional allocations that would convert to gifts upon formal acknowledgement of trustee discretion, and Daniel and Vanessa signed the acknowledgement document without objection, returning it promptly, and when the confirmation arrived in my mailbox, I placed it alongside the original name tag inside the portfolio, not as trophies but as reminders of transition. I did not feel triumphant, I felt balanced, because the goal had never been to reclaim dominance but to restore proportion, and proportion now existed where ambiguity once lingered. At a small family dinner held a month after the wedding, hosted at Daniel and Vanessa's home, I noticed that my place card bore only my name in elegant script, and before the meal began Vanessa stood and thanked each person who had contributed to the success of the wedding, including me by name, acknowledging not only financial support but guidance and patience, and her words were concise yet deliberate, and while I did not require public validation to affirm my worth, I recognized the importance of public correction when public misrepresentation had occurred. Daniel raised his glass in a brief toast to family continuity and mutual respect, and as glasses clinked softly around the table, I realized that the atmosphere felt lighter not because tension had vanished but because boundaries had been clarified. Driving home that evening beneath the familiar streetlights of Lincoln Park, I reflected on how easily generosity can be mistaken for obligation when left undefined, and how quickly respect can erode when silence is misread as consent, yet I also understood that structure, calmly enforced, restores equilibrium without spectacle. The wedding name tag had been intended as a quiet joke, perhaps even a test of how far assumption could stretch, but it became instead the catalyst for recalibration, and as I placed the framed photograph Emily had given me on the mantel beside older family portraits, I felt neither resentment nor superiority, only the steady knowledge that dignity preserved through clarity leaves no need for raised voices, and that sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is not confrontation but documentation.